Okay, so let's get started. Welcome everyone to a new webinar of the No Man's Land project on pre-modern Islamic manuscripts. Today I'm going to be very brief myself, just to explain a little bit, as always, the dynamics of the webinar. We have our guest speaker speaking for between 40, 45, perhaps 50 minutes. We are flexible with that, with our speaker. And after that, we will have a Q&A open to everyone. Remember that you can participate either by posting your questions in the chat. You can also use the Q&A option in the under your screen. You will see this option, or you can raise your hand, and I will, or me or Tanvir, who will be chairing the session, will allow you in to ask your question verbally directly to our speaker. So just from my side to welcome you all to this new lecture. Thank you to our speaker as well. And I pass the floor now to my colleague, Dr. Tanvir Ahmed, who will be introducing our speaker and leading the chairing the session afterward as well. Tanvir, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Bruno. And it is my deepest pleasure today to introduce a brilliant scholar and an amazing friend, Dr. Cyril Uy. Dr. Uy is the Assistant Professor of Religion at James Madison University. He holds a BA in Religious Studies from Yale University and an MPhil in Asian and Middle Eastern Studies from Cambridge. And he began his doctoral studies at Stanford University, where he also received an MA in Religious Studies along the way. Dr. Uy then transferred to Brown University, where he received his PhD in Religious Studies in 2021 before taking up his current position at JMU. His book project, Lost in a Sea of Letters, which is a fantastic title, Lost in a Sea of Letters, Saʿd Ḥamūya and the Plurality of Sufi Knowledge, is building on his dissertation research to construct a textured, granular, and wondrously colorful exploration of first principle concerns about knowledge to radically reopen our approaches to the problem of human knowing. So while the narrative in the dissertation in the book is grounded in the spatiotemporal context of medieval Central Asia and the Middle East, the questions that Dr. Uy poses cut far across any specific historical periods and do absolutely crucial work in reforging what intellectual history means more broadly to us today. By blasting open the supposed borders between abstract and tangible worlds, Dr. Uy's work sensitizes us to the very palpable rhythms of human struggles to know reality and asks us to carry that sensitivity with us in our narrative practices. And he does all of this with an amazing, rare sense of craftsmanship and style. So beyond his longer projects, Dr. Uy has published a critical edition and English translation of the Ikhwan al-Safa's Epistle on Spiritual Beings, which is published with Oxford University Press in conjunction with the Institute of Ismaili Studies. And his work has also been published in the catalog of Coptic and Arabic manuscripts in the Deir Surian. Dr. Uy has been the recipient of numerous prestigious grants and fellowships, including the Bishop Berkeley Prize, the Wrexham Prize at Yale, a Paul Mellon Fellowship, the Joukowsky Research Award, and the inaugural Mellon Teaching Fellowship in Global Islamic Studies at Connecticut College. He is also the bassist for the ska punk band Kill Lincoln, which has had multiple releases in the past years and has toured both within the United States and internationally across Japan. So check him out there as well as in his written academic work. So as our friend from grad school, Aziz al-Nasafi, would say, and without further ado, CJ, please take it away and enlighten us.
Well, thank you, Tanvir, for that introduction. That is very, very kind, way too kind, in fact. Oops, sorry, I am, can you all see my screen here? Okay, so I'll share this with you all. Yeah, first of all, I'd like to reiterate my thanks to Dr. Tanvir Ahmed. I'd like to thank Dr. Bruno Di Nicola, the No Man's Land Project, the Institute of Iranian Studies at the Österreichische Akademie der Wissenschaften for inviting me to share my work on this wonderful webinar series. So I'll be speaking today about a 13th century Sufi named Saʿd Ḥamūya and his mirror of spirits and signs upon tablets. That's the Sajanjal al-arwāḥ wa nuqush al-arwāḥ. I must begin with the customary, or perhaps a cliche mea culpa. This is very much a work in progress, an early attempt to delve into the world of this fascinating, influential, and enigmatic treatise. The key questions that guide my lecture today are essentially the same ones that struck me when I first came across a manuscript of the Mirror in the Süleymaniye archives. That is, how would medieval readers have engaged with this strange text? And likewise, what exactly was it supposed to do? With these questions in mind, my talk will unfold in roughly 4 parts. First, I'll give you a brief overview of Ḥamūya's biography and his uncomfortable place in contemporary scholarship. In the second section, we'll introduce Ḥamūya's mirror of spirits, its extant manuscript witnesses, and its ostensible form as a Sufi prayer text. The third section of the talk will explore what are perhaps the most striking features of the mirror, that is, its visual and diagrammatic dimensions. And finally, the fourth section will tie these threads together to argue that Ḥamūya's playful deconstruction of visual languages would have provoked advanced Sufi readers to improvise new connections across embodied, intertextual, and abstract theoretical domains, thus allowing them to experience and reproduce the infinite possibilities of reality within their own minds and their own bodies. So I'll start off with a brief biography of Saʿd ad-Dīn. While contemporary scholarship tends to dismiss Saʿd ad-Dīn as a marginal or perplexing figure at best, even a brief examination of his biography should give us pause. Ḥamūya's life and work linked masters of jurisprudence, ascetic discipline, visionary experience, divine love, advanced metaphysics, and institutionalized piety across the 13th century Islamic world. Born in Bahrabad in northeastern Iran, Ḥamūya hailed from a powerful family of Sufis who claimed seats of institutional authority across Egypt and Greater Syria. And after completing his early training in the exoteric religious sciences in Nishapur and Khwarazm, Saʿd ad-Dīn traveled throughout Central Asia, the Iranian plateau, and the Eastern Mediterranean. On these journeys, he forged intimate bonds with the most renowned Sufi masters of his time. These include Najmuddin Kubra and his Khalifas in Khwarazm, Shihabuddin Umar al-Suhrawardi in Baghdad, Ibn Arabi and Sultanuddin Qunawi in Damascus, and Aziz Nasafi, whom he trained upon his return to Khurasan. After his death then, Ḥamūya's legacy echoed throughout the centuries as a key source of ideological and genealogical authority for Mongol dynasts, Sufi hagiographers, messianic visionaries, and occult theorists alike. My point is, if we struggle to make sense of Saʿd ad-Dīn and his work, then it's because there's something fundamental we fail to grasp about his world. I suggest that the contemporary difficulties with Saʿd ad-Dīn's work stem primarily from our own epistemological inhibitions, the rationalist frameworks that dominate intellectual history, implicitly limit epistemology to logical systems that organize facts about the world. These approaches typically mine theoretical texts for propositions about the nature of reality, assembling these claims into stable metaphysical systems whose parts can then be tracked through time or stuck to specific problems for comparative analysis. Now, when confronted with Ḥamūya's work, such methods run up against an analytical impasse. As he plumbs the hidden recesses of reality, Saʿd ad-Dīn twists and turns through jarring non sequiturs, recondite illusions, arcane diagrams, and above all, a feverish obsession with the limitless possibilities of the Arabic alphabet. His ontological vision is not one of discrete parts and stable structures. It's a dynamic play of forces whose qualities and boundaries are endlessly reconfigured. For Ḥamūya, it's not the flat surface of the page, but rather living, breathing, and speaking bodies that can encompass and reflect the inexhaustible potential of reality. So Ḥamūya's mirror of spirits then affords us with the opportunity to explore this dynamic cosmic vision and the performative strategies through which he attempted to inculcate it within the minds and bodies of his readers. Now, since this is a webinar dedicated to Islamic manuscripts, let's first begin with a discussion of the mirror's extant witnesses. So, despite its popularity among Sufis and occultists across the medieval and early modern Islamic world, few manuscript copies of Ḥamūya's mirror of spirits and signs on tablets survive today. Extant witnesses of the text include Fatih 2645 and Jadallah 1541, which are both housed in the Süleymaniye library in Istanbul, and a third copy in Mashhed's Aslan Quds library. And I should note that I actually have only been able to access the two copies in the Süleymaniye library and not the one in Mashhed. A brief excerpt of the text can also be found in a compilation of occult sciences and letter divination located in Tehran's Majlis-e-Shuraya Islami library, although it's more than likely that other fragments and copies await identification and analysis as well. Now, in addition to this paucity of manuscript witnesses, our extant copies of the mirror diverge significantly in terms of both content and organization. So neither Fatih 2645 nor Jadallah 1541 seems to preserve a complete copy of the text, and both manuscripts actually lack a clear structure. The proliferation of jarring breaks, blank spaces, alternate hands, replaced folia, and abrupt endings in both give the impression that A, the copies were bound or rebound out of order, B, that their scribes struggled to follow their exemplars, or C, that the mirror of spirits itself resists a linear progression and self-consciously subverts the notion of an original, stable, or exhaustible text. In light of these considerations, I focus my attention today on Fatih 2645, which presents a more expansive version of the mirror of spirits and includes a mid-text colophon dating the copy to May 1258. That's Jumad al-Awwal 656. And this is just 6 years after Saʿd ad-Dīn's death. Now let's dive into some of the manuscript's contents. The first half of the Mirror of Spirits takes the form of a typical Sufi prayer manual, offering detailed instructions in Arabic and Persian for an extended program of prayers, glorifications, supplications, and Qur'anic recitations. The text opens at nightfall, outlining a set of supererogatory prayers to accompany ritual purification, before leading the reader through a preliminary vigil consisting primarily of prayer cycles, litanies, and supplications. After the preliminary vigil comes to a close, Ḥamuya initiates the program of the mirror proper, which begins with a series of supplications to accompany the sunnah and obligatory morning prayers. And I'll just mark here on the manuscript, the start of the Sajanjal proper right there. Upon completing the obligatory morning prayer and its attendant supplications, Ḥamuya instructs his readers to, quote, commence the litany, which consists of an initial sequence of prayers and supplications, a recital of God's 99 most beautiful names, a second sequence of prayers and supplications, and a recitation of Qur'anic verses that progresses sequentially from Surat al-Fatiha to Surat al-Nas. This section of the text ends with a return to Surat al-Baqarah, specifically the verse Alif Lam Mim. This is the book in which there is no doubt, followed by a final prayer affirming the truth of the Qur'an. To give you a sense of the text's style and its contents, I translate two brief passages here, one from the preliminary night vigil and one from the mirror's litany. So the passage from the night vigil reads, after that, one should recite Adam's prayer, God's prayers be upon him. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, O God, pray for Muhammad and his family. O God, you know what I have kept secret and made manifest, so take my penance. You know what I need, so grant my request. You know what is in my soul, so forgive my sins. Truly no one forgives sins but you. O God, I ask for faith to busy my heart, for the real certainty of knowing that only what you have written befalls me. I ask for contentment with what you have decreed for me. May God pray for Muhammad and his entire family. There is no might and strength save God's, the sublime, the supreme. Here I am, O God, here I am at your service and pleasure. All goodness lies before you, stems from you, and returns to you. I turn my face towards you, ask for your forgiveness, and repent before you. May God pray for Muhammad and his entire family. After this, one should pray 2 more prayer cycles with the intention of spending the night in vigil and seeking forgiveness. Now, the quote, or the passage from the litany reads as follows. One should say the following 3 times. God is most great, God is most great, God is most great. There is no God but God. God is most great, God is most great. Praise be to God. Then one says the following 10 times. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, there is no might and strength save God's, the sublime, supreme. So these excerpts reflect several key themes and strategies that pervade the mirror of spirits as a whole. Drawing from a robust arsenal of Sufi spiritual technologies, Ḥamūya's text develops an arduous program of physical, mental, and affective esquisses designed to discipline the self and train one's entire being on the real. Execution of the mirror's instructions demands both a steadfast endurance and a fastidious attention to detail, balancing the embodied demands of ritual prayer, that is speaking, standing, bowing, sitting, prostrating, with the cognitive rigor of sustained reflection amidst a swirl of exhausting yet meticulous repetition. For Ḥamūya, these devotional technologies functioned as keys to experiential knowledge of reality. In his Repose of the Righteous, that's a guide for beginners, he explains that it's through an all-encompassing attention to prayer that one bears witness to the real's beauty and majesty. Likewise, his Realities of the Letters names prayer as the, quote, form of the intellect, end quote, the means through which one perceives things as they really are. And he associates prayer with the knowledge by which one can achieve true union with the real. Ḥamūya's colleagues, in the authoritative Sufi manuals upon which they drew, wrote at length about the intimate relationship between prayer and knowledge. For these figures, Sufi devotional practices functioned as an embodied and infinitely generative Qur'anic hermeneutics. I'll use al-Ghazali as a brief example, both because his formulations are pretty straightforward and because Ḥamūya engaged carefully with his work. So in the Etiquette of Qur'an recitation, that is the 8th book of his Revival of Religious Sciences, al-Ghazali writes, the heart is like a mirror and the passions like rust. The Qur'an's meanings are like the forms that appear in the mirror. And askesis, the word here I'm translating is riyada, removes passions from the heart just as a polisher burnishes a mirror. These meanings and the knowledge that accompanies them, al-Ghazali goes on to explain, are potentially endless. He says, in the Qur'an, there's an explanation of his essence, his acts, his attributes. There is no end to this knowledge. On the Mystery of Prayer, that's the 4th book of the Revival of Religious Sciences, al-Ghazali links this kind of ascesis specifically to prayer, framing the practice as, quote, the key to hearts within which the secrets of the Qur'an's words are unveiled. So in one's heightened state of awareness, al-Ghazali explains that one not only attends to the semantic implications of each verse, but engages with its affective qualities as well. Here, he explains that real knowledge is inseparable from affect, and that the Qur'an's endless possibilities ebb and flow in accordance with each individual's spiritual capacities. While these types of devotional practice were, and still are, ubiquitous across Muslims of all stripes, Ḥamūya and the medieval Sufis with whom he was in dialogue implied that their specific techniques of spiritual discipline transformed prayer, both obligatory and supererogatory, into an embodied technology with which to plumb the bottomless depths of the Qur'an. The key takeaway point here is that they understood these techniques to be tailored completely to the spiritual capacity of their operators, thus generating a constellation of possible meanings that shifted in relation to the dynamic flux of one's ever-changing spiritual, intellectual, and affective states. Read in this way, Ḥamūya's Mirror of Spirits does exactly what it says on the tin, so to speak. It forges a Sufi technology of the self through which readers could orient themselves towards the real and contemplate the kaleidoscopic flashes of revelation refracted within them. While the first half of the mirror is virtually indistinguishable from the countless other Sufi prayer texts that can be found in manuscript libraries across the world, it's in the second half that Ḥamuya lets his freak flag fly. Here, the shaykh's deconstructive tendencies are on full display as he warps the conventions of Sufi prayer books beyond all recognition. So the Fatih manuscript marks this transition with a blank folio and title page, keys to the heavens and earth, openers of the unseen and obligatory. That's maqalid as-samawat wal-ard wa mafatih al-ghayb wal-fal. From here on out, the mirror envelops readers in a tempest of bewildering operations. So here we find Ḥamuya writing divine names in stacked and mirrored pairs. He transcribes long lists of Qur'ānic verses with specific catchwords. So all of the verses on this page are centered around the human being, al-insan. He reproduces the name of God each time it appears in the Quran. This takes up roughly 18 folia in the Fatih manuscript. And he scribbles indecipherable strings of intersecting, stretched, or inverted letters. We have these here as well. Perhaps most distinctive of all, however, are the arcane diagrams whose cryptic symbols, warped letters, and tangled forms engulf many of the mirror's folia. So I'll just flip through a few of these here so you can get the sense of what they look like. Another, and this is the last one I have for you. So the question is, what are these strange forms doing here? And how might we begin to make sense of them? To think through these questions, let's take a closer look at the mirror's visual language in the context of other contemporary texts. So on first glance, several of the more straightforward diagrams that populate Ḥamuya's mirror bring to mind the visual strategies of his 13th century Sufi colleagues, most notably those of Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi. As Ali Kardurawari has recently argued, the holograph cosmological diagrams that are found in the second recension of Ibn Arabi's Meccan Revelations work together with the surrounding text to articulate the interplay between the singular divine reality and its multidimensional reflections in creation. Ibn Arabi's complex textual visual program thus teaches readers to negotiate jarring jumps in cosmic perspective, scale, and time, leading them ultimately to the realization that it's through their own reality that they, as reflections of the real, may most perfectly witness the real. Furthermore, Kardurawari demonstrates how Ibn Arabi's diagrams appropriate the visual language of Arabic philosophical and scientific discourse, subsuming these cosmic cartographies and their attendant rational frameworks within his own universalizing Sufi vision. So here on folio 93A of Ibn Arabi's holograph Futuhat, for example, the shaykh presents a series of 9 divine names placed within circles, arranged in rows, and set over other circles bearing the name of terrestrial and soteriological principles. As Kardurawari argues, the specific spatial orientation of these circles works together with the surrounding text to articulate the hierarchical relationships between the divine names, these here, interactions between these attributes and the terrestrial realm, located here, and the ways in which these interactions catalyze eschatological transformations, is right here. So Ibn Arabi's textual visual program thus encourages readers to map abstract principles onto imaginal space in order to visualize and manipulate the dynamic processes and relationships in which they are embedded. In many respects, Ḥamuya's mirror shares this visual language of concentric circles, intersecting lines, and primary geometric shapes that spatialize various relationships between divine, metaphysical, and human principles. Like Ibn Arabi's image discussed earlier, the twin diagrams that inaugurate the second half of the mirror consist primarily of divine attributes set within circles and arranged according to distinct spatial relationships. Unlike Ibn Arabi, however, Ḥamuya refuses his readers any accompanying discursive material to guide their engagement, while Ibn Arabi forges careful links between his diagrammatic program and dynamic ontological processes. Ḥamuya prefaces his image with a set of supplications alone. It's this up here. I suggest then that Saʿd draws on the visual language of contemporary Sufi texts like that of Ibn Arabi to provoke the kinds of visualization practices encouraged by them. Yet he leaves the hermeneutical output of these processes radically open. In other words, each group of circles and names, their spatial organization and their points of overlap, disjuncture, and tangent section operate as visual guides for the imaginal manipulation of principles across potentially endless ontological and conceptual schemes. By untethering his images from a singular discursive frame or authorial perspective, he leaves them radically open to the interpretive capacities of his readers. In a sense, then, Ḥamuya actually turns Ibn Arabi's strategies against him. Just as the Meccan revelations appropriates the visual language of philosophers to subsume their rational methods within the multitudinous vistas of Ibn Arabi's universalizing vision, Ḥamuya's deconstructive retooling of this same language implicitly parochializes Ibn Arabi's approach as yet another limit on the infinite dynamism of the divine self-disclosure. Rather than attempting to subsume reality within his singular hermeneutical vision, Ḥamuya recruits his audience to produce this infinity for him through their interpretations. Now, Saʿd's evocative visual style and his refusal to ground images within a stable discursive framework allows his diagrams to resonate across a web of genres and practices that extend beyond the typical orbit of Sufi theoretical texts. So if we return here to folia 73b and 74a of Fatih 2645, we may begin to notice key details that serve to further distinguish Ḥamuya's diagrams from those found in the Meccan revelations. Each of these images, for example, presents a pair of divine names, so one at the very top and one at the very bottom, whose circles are circumscribed by quadrilaterals made up of extended Arabic letter forms. So that's these forms here. While the lettrist squares that we find here might seem strange when considered in relation to Ibn Arabi's cosmological diagrams, their visual language finds homophones in the seals and talismans of medieval occult praxis. So the closest visual analogs to Ḥamuya's lettrist squares are to be found in a body of texts and objects that Travis Zadeh calls Qur'ānic theurgy. And as Zadeh explains, this corpus employs divine names, pious formulae, and Qur'ānic language to construct a variety of talismans, charms, and magic squares. So Abdullah al-Yafi's string of pearls on the special properties of the glorious Qur'an, for example, includes a quadrilateral talisman constructed from the elongated words and letters of the Basmala. To corroborate the talisman's efficacy, al-Yafi offers a brief narrative from a respected hadith scholar whose fever was cured when the image was written on a piece of paper and slipped underneath his head. So again, this is a talisman to cure fevers. Ḥamuya's lettrist squares also bear a resemblance to a talisman found in Ahmed al-Buni's Subtleties of Illusions Regarding the Sublime Letters. While several of al-Buni's lettrist diagrams share a visual language with those found in Ḥamuya's mirror, it's the talisman inscribed, possibly by the copyist or a later owner, on the title page of manuscript Arabe 2657 from the Bibliothèque Nationale de France that is most relevant to our concerns here. This anonymous talisman consists of a quadrilateral form constructed from the Qur'anic phrase, "His word is truth, all control belongs to him," with the number 3139 written in Eastern Arabic numerals beneath. So as Jean-Charles Coulon notes, the talisman is actually not present anywhere else in al-Buni's subtleties, nor do any of the text diagrams elongate Qur'ānic verses in a similar way. So we could see this talisman then as a figure following Quran that functions as a protective seal for the manuscript as a whole. I argue that Ḥamūya's incorporation of letters squares into his diagrams charges his text with the occult efficacy of Qur'anic theurgy. That is to say, the shaykh's appropriation of these forms sets his image within the genre of talismans, amulets, and charms that were expected to operate upon the bodies and spirits of those who produced, contemplated, or otherwise engaged with them. As was the case with his cosmological diagrams, however, Ḥamūya's use of these familiar forms simultaneously strips them of the visual and textual conventions through which they typically became meaningful. Unlike al-Yaf'i's fever talisman, the mirror's squares deny readers a stable narrative through which to clarify their intended use or to certify their efficacy. Ḥamūya's squares thus seem to imbue his text with a practical potency while leaving the nature and the theoretical underpinning of that potency undetermined. So one might note here that this lack of narrative framing mirrors the talisman inscribed on the cover page of al-Buni's subtleties. Even here, though, Ḥamūya's image stands out on account of another key distinction. The words and letters out of which they are constructed are ambiguous to the point of being illegible. Both al-Yaf'i and al-Buni's talismans bear Qur'anic verses that are elongated and overlap to form quadrilateral shapes, but they're not warped beyond recognition. A reader examining the subtlety seal might thus ascertain its efficacy by identifying its Qur'anic source and recalling the occult properties and talismanic operations associated with that verse. One could perhaps consult a text like al-Yaf'i's string of pearls to do just that. Readers faced with Ḥamūya's squares, however, are not so lucky. While the sides of his talisman evoke Arabic letter forms, the words and phrases that they produce are fleeting and ambiguous. The image invites readers to experiment with different permutations, but these interpretive possibilities continually slip away as soon as one attempts a definitive interpretation. So, like his appropriation of cosmological diagrams, I suggest that Ḥamūya's deconstructive manipulation of talismanic forms implicitly parochializes the authoritative claims of his rivals. Within the shaykh's milieu, the practical efficacy of talismans seems to have been taken as a social fact. How these efficacious technologies were theorized and operated, however, functioned as a ground upon which different individuals and social intellectual communities could contest the authoritative reach of their epistemological frameworks. As Noah Gardner has argued, for example, al-Buni's use of talismanic diagrams limits the proper activation of these potent forms to the cosmological frames, ritual practices, and visual literacy of his own initiatic Sufi communities. Likewise, Ibn Arabi's expositions on the science of letters subsume the production of talismans within his universalizing Sufi metaphysics without offering concrete instructions regarding the practicalities of their production. Ibn Arabi, of course, assures his readers that he is more than capable of such practical feats. He merely refuses to transmit this dangerous knowledge publicly. In addition to Sufis, figures dedicated to falsafa, kalam, and occult science put forward their own claims to talismanic knowledge and authority. In his monumental Qur'anic tafsir, The Keys to the Unseen, the peripatetic-leaning Ash'ari theologian Fakhruddin al-Razi domesticates talismans within a Neoplatonized metaphysics, ascribing their efficacy ultimately to the power of God, albeit mediated through heavenly bodies and spiritual beings via the cosmic processes of emanation. Al-Razi likewise offers a theoretical justification for the unknown formula and unintelligible incantations often found on talismans and amulets like Ḥamūya's, arguing that these words enact their effects on weaker souls by inspiring fear and awe. So by inscribing talismanic forms into the mirror, I suggest that Ḥamuya stakes a claim within this theoretical practical arena. The text simultaneously appropriates the taken for granted efficacy of these forms while circumscribing their operation within the embodied and effective technologies of Sufi prayer. By leaving the discursive and theoretical grounds of their efficacy underdetermined, Ḥamuya does not limit the spiritual practical potential of his text to a single metaphysical framework. Rather, the shaykh implicitly acknowledges the plurality of these approaches and puts them to use as vehicles for his own deconstructive and radically open worldview. The strength of Ḥamuya's method lies precisely in staging Sufi devotional practice as a dynamic frame within which readers could improvise with the generative ambiguities of his talismanic forms. By leaving the meaning of these forms open to his readers, Ḥamuya crafts his text as a polished mirror, capable of illuminating and thus activating even the most adept operators' inner realities. So, since all of this sounds fairly abstract, I'll spend the rest of the talk walking us through a specific example to explore how these performative strategies may have played out for Ḥamuya's readers. Here, I'll focus on the diagram that immediately follows the circles and magic squares discussed in the previous section. This diagram takes the form of a common tablet whose rectangular body and trapezoidal handle are outlined in black. At the very bottom of the image, we have Qur'anic quotation in red and black ink that seems to identify it as the heavenly tablet upon which the archetypal Qur'an is inscribed. It says, truly, this is a glorious Qur'an written on a preserved tablet. The text that follows does not offer an explicit guide for interpretation, only a series of Qur'anic quotations centered around the command say, that is, qul. So I'll highlight some of these here for you. While Ḥamuya offers no instructions to help us contextualize this diagram, I suggest that the mirror's ritual practices, its structural organization, and playful deconstruction of visual languages all operate in tandem to transform the text and its images into a kind of infinitely generative spiritual technology. So let's first turn our attention towards a curious letters symbol that resembles a letter kef written in the Persian style with an elongated meme nestled within its central opening. We might also read this as a meme stretched out into an aleph. So I'll circle this here, and there's another instance of it down here. Erected at the top of this kef are three alephs connected at the base, resembling a trident. And the tridental alephs are also reproduced on their own throughout the diagram. So we can see them here, here, and here. These visual components open a web of elusive possibilities that enrich the mirror's program of prayer and recitation. The diagram's kef symbol, for example, encourages viewers to put the mirror into dialogue with performative expressions scattered throughout Ḥamuya's writings. The lamp of Sufism, for example, sets the letter kef within strategies of sound, sensation, and illusion to explore the simultaneous manifestation and concealment of the real in creation. In that text, the shaykh presents a series of letrous riffs on kef, both as a letter and as a sound, coupling this sonic and sensory play with an array of scriptural, intertextual, and technical allusions. Each word becomes a site of endless interpretation, leaving readers without any solid conceptual mooring. At the same time, by spinning these shifting forms and associations around a single set of symbols, sounds, and sensations, Ḥamuya balances the experience of dynamic transformation and limitless possibility with a sense of sonic and sensory unity. So the key point here is that the kef symbol that we find inscribed in Ḥamuya's diagram opens up intertexts with the kind of performative letrist discussions that are a hallmark of his work. Now, the tridental alephs that are affixed to the mirror's kef symbols and rendered on their own evoke a discussion in which Ḥamuya likens the unfurling of God's light, that is the act of creation, as a manifestation of the word God, which he says is itself a revelation of the phrase, verily I am, that is, inni ana in Arabic. In the lamp of Sufism and such works as exegesis of the noble Basmala, the shaykh visualizes the Arabic phrase, inni ana, verily I am, as 3 alifs and 2 noons, each letter of which corresponds to a range of divine and human principles. The tablet diagram's tridental alifs, therefore, can be read as 3 alifs joined at the base and simultaneously as 2 dotless noons joined in the middle. That is an iconic representation of inni ana and the dynamic mechanisms that the phrase embodies. Finally, the elongated meme within the kaf's central opening evokes another letters passage from the lamp of Sufism. Here, Ḥamuya likens the visual and conceptual relationship between alif and meme to that of a penis and a vagina, framing the interaction between these sexual organs as microcosmic expressions of creative processes that reverberate across divine, cosmic, and human realms. Together, the shaykh explains alif and meme form the water of life, from which emerges the letter kaf, and implicitly the play of manifestation and concealment that characterizes reality writ large. So, read in context then, we may understand the visual program that unfolds across folia 73b to 74b as diagramming a mode of self-disclosure, or the process by which the divine attributes become manifest through creation. In this way, the tablet diagram's archetypal Qur'an becomes none other than the universe itself. Here again, we find a common theme that spans across Ḥamuya's work, the idea that God, or the real, is a singular ontological point whose realities are drawn out into a legible cosmic script through the act of creation. By placing the divine names in heavenly tablet before the mirror's extensive Qur'anic quotations, Ḥamuya implicitly frames the language of his text as a microcosmic manipulation of this macrocosmic script and a point of access to the realities that it makes legible. Marking the tablet diagram with iconic allusions to discussions scattered throughout his work, the shaykh opens a web of intertextual associations through which readers can make the mirror's words, which are also God's words, meaningful. I say they're also God's words because so much of the text and so much of what follows here is a recitation or repetition of Qur'anic verses. At the same time, however, the discussions to which these intertexts point are not neatly bounded expositions of doctrine, but themselves highly elusive textual performances left open to the active engagement of advanced readers' minds and bodies. Far from a static representation of metaphysical principles then, the tablet diagram mediates between the mirror's prayer practices and the performative approaches to reality that Ḥamuya develops across his work. And in doing so, it supercharges the associative links cultivated by Sufi prayer with new layers of possibilities. Ḥamuya augments the diagram's performative qualities with divine names in black and rows of detached letters in red inscribed on the tablet's body and beyond its borders. So throughout the image, we find the following divine names: the creator, the unique, the close, the eternal, the most noble, the first, and the director. The tablet's primarily detached letters swarm together around these names in sequences whose repetitions and permutations seem to occur at random. Now, throughout his written corpus, Ḥamuya uses the dynamic and associative potential of the Arabic letters to articulate what I call a relational approach to reality. So what that means is, just as the letters of the alphabet become meaningful only through the bundles in which they're embedded, things like words, talismanic operations, sentences, stanzas, paragraphs, etc., so too divine attributes and created entities can only be understood through their dynamic relationships with one another and the shifting points of view according to which these relationships are considered. So moving across Ḥamūya's work, or even working through a single text, the qualities and associations ascribed to a single letter are continually expanded, substituted, or reconfigured. By refusing to stabilize the mirror's tablet diagram with concrete instructions or theoretical framing, Ḥamūya leaves the associative potential of its letters radically open to readers. Such radical openness, in turn, provokes audiences to improvise meaningful connections across a range of abstract and experiential frames. As they work their way through the diagram, readers must experiment with the interpretive possibilities of each individual letter. So, let's see, oops, that's the wrong slide here. So if we take these letter qafs beyond the tablet's right-hand border, should we read them in dialogue with the disconnected letter that inaugurates Surat al-Qaf? Should they be taken as representations of the letter, the number 100 in the abjad system and subjected to alphanumeric calculations? Could they have something to do with the ensuing Qur'anic verses that revolve around permutations of the command qul, say? What about the oral and embodied sensations that arise from this repetitive recitation? Might they stand in for God's potency and power, qudratul quwwat, as suggested in the lamp of Sufism? Or perhaps they should be interpreted in light of the cosmic circle of Qaf, whose elaboration in the Book of the Beloved spans polyglot poetry, prophetology, Qur'anic exegesis, lecherous transformations, Sunni-Shia relations, and more. Without a discursive framework to direct them, readers must negotiate all of these possibilities in dialogue with the layers of effective, embodied, and discursive meaning that are generated by Qur'anic language within the ritual practical context of the mirror's Sufi liturgy. The distinctive visual dimensions of Ḥamūya's diagram work to expand the image's interpretive possibilities. So as readers move through diagrammatic space, they must not only grapple with the proliferating interpretive possibilities of each letter, but also the visual relationships that emerge between them. The spatial organization of the tablet's detached letters evoke the talismanic visual language analyzed in the previous section. One might ask, are these sequences of magic squares or alphanumeric calculations of the sort found in al-Buni's work? Detached letters to be linked into longer phrases, a cryptic code to be deciphered, schematic representations of relationships between divine attributes, entities, the Qur'an, and language. What effect are they to have on the body and soul of the operator? By appropriating and deconstructing these forms, Ḥamūya provokes readers to experiment, again, with the efficacious operations of these forms in conjunction with the dynamic bundles of embodied, effective, and intellectual meaning outlined above. The organization of the tablet's letters likewise encourages readers to explore the relational possibilities that arise when considering the image from different points along the diagrammatic space. Forms rotated along an axis, for example, might provoke readers to turn the diagram, emphasizing the legibility of some elements while obscuring that of others. So the circle at the center of the diagram's rectangular body here is circumscribed with repetitions and permutations of the phrase, "O God, Allahumma," written in red ink. Turning the diagram, or oneself around the diagram to follow the phrases that circumscribe the image's center circle, focuses one's attention on invocations to God, rendering the remainder of the tablet's letters, symbols, and divine names a peripheral blur. So this might look a bit cheesy, but I've tried to render this in an animation on the slide here. So if you try to follow along the Allahumma around the center circle, everything else around the outside kind of fades into out of focus for you. So such a play of manifestation and concealment would not only mirror the dynamics of creation outlined earlier, but also the subsequent Qur'anic recitations that orient a multitude of verses around stable catchphrases. We might imagine such an operation as enabling viewers to visualize the relationship between the singular unity of reality, the meticulous repetition of Sufi prayer, and the endless webs of abstract experiential possibilities that emerge from and recede back into them. So I argue that it's through a deconstructive appropriation of ubiquitous visual languages that Ḥamuya hijacks their performative potential, while also leaving their particularities radically open to viewers. I offer all of the questions and suggestions above not as exercises in creative speculation, but rather to demonstrate how the diagram's spatial qualities themselves may have worked to enhance the performative dimensions and interpretive openness of the mirror. In Ibn Arabi's Meccan Revelations, as we saw earlier, the layout of metaphysical principles in diagrammatic space and the transformation of the space across folia enabled readers to imagine and manipulate abstract processes across multiple levels of reality. Guided by Ibn Arabi's theoretical framing, readers could follow the shaykh's jarring shifts in ontological and temporal perspective as a practice of spiritual ascesis, ultimately allowing them to experience their own selves and the worlds around them as manifestations of the real. Ḥamuya's playful deconstruction of these generic conventions within the ritual framework of Sufi prayer directs audiences to bring Qur'anic language into dialogue with their own affective states, while also mapping these correlations across a range of intertexts, cosmologies, and theoretical frameworks. While the shaykh uses visual language to structure readers' thinking and feeling, his deconstructive tendencies and strategies emphasize qualities of dynamism, openness, and process in and of themselves. As readers improvise with elusive meanings and deconstructed visual forms, they do not reach some stable secret about themselves, the world, and God, but rather come to self-consciously embody the fundamental qualities of reality. The goal here is not to wed oneself to stable structures or specific connections, but rather to cultivate a sensibility through which one can manipulate disparate data at macro, meso, and microcosmic scales. The mirror and its diagrams thus give readers the tools through which they can read and reproduce the dynamic relational grammars through which the real itself speaks. So I just want to wrap up here with a brief observation about the overall form of this tablet diagram. Now, for literate viewers, the image's rectangular body and trapezoidal handle would have evoked the same wooden slates upon which they had learned to read and recite the Qur'an as children. So Conrad Hirschler notes that medieval children's schools across the Islamic world employed such slates as part of a pedagogical program to teach basic reading, writing, and recitation skills. So I pulled a few images here from Hirschler's The Written Word in the Medieval Arabic Lands. These images are from the 13th century across the Islamic world. And we can see the form, same form as the tablet diagram here. You can see it here, here, and in this Persian example as well. Here's a close-up. So students would first learn the detached letters by copying them out on their slates. And once they could recognize, reproduce, and recite all of the letters and their possible vocalizations, they'd learn to join their forms together in arbitrary combinations. Finally, students would learn to put these sounds and symbols together into longer words, verses, and chapters that make up the Qur'an. The wooden slates upon which the mirror's tablet diagram is modeled thus sit at the center of an embodied pedagogy that taught students to negotiate connections across experiential and intellectual domains. These connections enabled students to engage with the world in a new way, opening up a new approach not only to the word of God, but to knowledge in general. Drawing upon these effective memories and experiences, the form of Ḥamuya's tablet diagram encourages readers to engage with it, and indeed with the recitations, operations, and images that follow, as students of a cosmic script and a divine grammar. Read thus, we might imagine Ḥamuya's text not only as a mirror, but as a potent spiritual technology that reflects and refracts the world, illuminating new points of entry into the endless ebb and flow of reality. Thank you.